After part one of this unique double-issue podcast conversation with Michelangelo specialist Bill Wallace, focusing on the specifics of the manufacturing process of Michelangelo's art, we now turn to the second major area where Bill believes he's made the greatest contribution to Michelangelo's studies, deepening our collective understanding of how this uniquely transformative cultural force was both influenced by and strongly influenced other great artists from his contemporary world. There are, of course, many ways to approach such an investigation, given that every great artist of the age naturally felt the overwhelming impact of Michelangelo, most famously including both of the other two high Renaissance titans, Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. But we're going to focus on the relationship between Michelangelo and another dominant artist of the age, the great Venetian master Titian. Since, as it happens, Bill has recently published an entire book exploring their relationship in detail. So this is, I think, a good opportunity, a good segue to move to the second major topic that we talked about, which wasn't just the stereotype of the false stereotype of Michelangelo as this loner, although I'm going to keep thumping on that drum just a little bit more, but much more broadly, looking at him in his social world, looking at the interactions that he had with others and their interaction with him, regarding him as, instead of this, complete divine alien, as it were, but a man, however accomplished, of his time. And from that, I want to be talking quite a bit about your latest book, Michelangelo and Titian. So a lot of what the questions I'm going to ask are going to be related to that. You start off in your book talking about the idea of influence, and at least that's my perception of it. And in some cases, examining, what is genuine influence as opposed to maybe non-influence, or what we ascribe to being influence but really isn't influence. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I found that actually quite fascinating. So you mentioned a couple of examples in the past where art historians have looked at influence or alleged influence between, in this case, the idea of Michelangelo on Titian. You mentioned art history is a relatively young discipline. It seems to me like this is looking at influence in all the wrong places to me. So that's the way I would look at it. Say, oh yeah, this body, this arm is over here, and that looks like some guy over there. Not even thinking about how that information may have been transmitted, but just by looking at the physical nature of similar body types. And I think it's not just that that's superficial, but that can't be the way that human beings actually influence one another. It's just curious to me as an outsider looking at this to think, really, people actually took this stuff seriously?
Thank you. Yes, it's the perfect question. Let's talk about that upper comparison. The suggestion that Titian, perhaps in the murder scene on the right hand, was influenced or had taken the pose of Adam and Eve from the Sistine ceiling and reversed it. And this is the very famous example that was suggested in a lecture by Johannes Wilde, one of the great Michelangelo scholars, back in the 1950s. And this is a perfect case of one of these things, a suggestion that was made. He didn't have any proof about this connection at all, but it just seemed visually like they were related. And that suggestion made in the lecture got repeated over and over and over again without people really hearing, what that initial suggestion was, which was a suggestion. And this is a case that happens frequently where things in scholarship get repeated really without checking your footnotes. And they get repeated over and over in such a regular manner that they become fact. And this is one of those cases that's become fact, that Titian must have seen Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. And this is where I really enjoyed writing this part of the book, because I wanted you to, okay, let's imagine exactly how this connection worked. Did it really happen? They are painting at 300 miles apart from one another at exactly the same time. They're both working in fresco in very, very separate cities, 300 miles away from one another. So if Titian knew Michelangelo's Sistine, we'll have to ask how. He doesn't come to Rome until 30 years later. So can we imagine that maybe a friend of Titian was in Rome and he broke into the Sistine Chapel, because the Sistine Chapel was very much closed to the public, and Michelangelo was being very, very private about what he was painting on the Sistine. But somehow this person got in there, saw this scene, and immediately thought, oh, Titian he has to use this up in Padua. So somehow that person either drew or made a mental image of this and ran up to Padua, 300 miles away, and said, Titian, wait, this is how Michelangelo is doing it on the Sistine ceiling. You have to do it this way too. And we begin to compound illogicalities. It's just impossible to imagine that is in any way what actually happened. And ultimately, I would say it's unnecessary. Titian is perfectly capable of inventing a kind of pose of figures that may superficially resemble the Michelangelo, but they are radically different when you look more closely at them. One is a temptation scene that's moving very slowly and with sort of anxiety, whereas on the right-hand side, it's a murder scene that's happening very rapidly, and this woman is about to be stabbed to death. These pictures ultimately have really nothing to do with one another in terms of subject or style. They just sort of very, very superficially seem to resemble one another, only in reverse.
Yeah. And before we move on to the getting your thoughts on the next one, I mean, when I read this, I thought to myself, well, in addition to all of that, and of course your points are very convincing, in addition to all of that, isn't that just a natural thing to be doing? I mean, if somebody's coming at you with a knife, isn't the obvious thing to do to put up your arm like this to be able to try to defend yourself and stop them? I mean, that's just a natural human reflex. And so even ascribing that to some kind of symmetry or influence or relationship with somebody else who, in a completely different context, puts up their arm, I mean, it just seems absurd to me.
I think you're absolutely right, but this connection has been solidified into fact until hopefully my book sort of reverses that idea and makes one realize that Titian at this point still is inventing entirely on his own. And he's aware of Michelangelo by reputation, but by no means does he have any kind of visual connection to Michelangelo yet.
And moving to the second example that you give, maybe you can say a little bit about that as well.
This is like your arm thrown up because you put your leg up on a stone. Do the two figures have to look alike? Does one figure depend on the other because a leg is up? Because other than that, their arms are in completely different locations. It's a painting versus a sculpture. And there was no possible way that Titian could have actually seen this sculpture. It was carved in Rome and was unavailable. Was not yet out of Michelangelo's studio. So it's just illogical to sort of make this comparison, especially when we have this Titian drawing. And that's really what Titian is influenced by, is his drawing of a hanging man. And you see it in the drawing that he has to draw it 4 or 5 times before he gets the idea of how to do it. And that drawing has nothing to do with the Michelangelo. So Titian is really influenced by Titian. And he's perfectly capable at this point in his career to create a nude figure of this sort of beauty and three-dimensionality. And that's because he's looking at his own contemporaries, Mantegna, Giovanni Bellini, all of whom in the north in Veneto are painting nude Saint Sebastians and other figures that are nude. As I say in my book, not every single nude has to be traced to Michelangelo. There were other artists capable of making the nude.
Another related point to this notion of influence and really exploring influence is what I think you're doing is you're focusing on the power of imagination. Frequently in your writings, or at least not tremendously infrequently, you will say words to the effect of, okay, well, now I'm going to speculate, or there's nothing particularly delineated in the historical record which supports what I'm about to say, but it seems to me plausible based upon what I've done before, what I've read and what I've seen, and what primary sources and secondary sources and so forth say. So, and my sense is that you believe strongly in the power of imagination to be able to, again, better understand the individual in his or her time and the influences that are acting upon that person as people, because it's our job, maybe as historians. I'm allegedly quoting you. Of course, you didn't say this, but it's our job as historians to try as best as we can to try to not just interpret the past, but in a sense reimagine the past. And in order to do that, we obviously tautologically have to use our powers of imagination, but not just imaginating in a fabricating sort of way. We have to imagine in a way based upon the most reliable information that we have at the time. So it's our job to get that information and then couple that with our power of imagination. That's point number one. Moreover, point number two, if we just rely on documentary evidence, we're going to be missing stuff necessarily. Because, for example, we can say, oh no, I don't believe in any of that, imagination stuff or that subjective stuff. I just want to have the absolutely stone cold facts that I can find in the archives. Well, the archives are going to be missing a lot of stuff necessarily. If we're just looking at correspondence between friends, for example, we're not going to have much of that until those friends are, if, as and when those friends actually move apart from each other and are in different places. Most of the time, they've actually spent time right beside each other. So it's not just a nice thing to be able to do. To some degree, it's an essential thing to be able to use these sort of subtle, maybe more subjective aspects of imagination, coupled with our knowledge as best as we can. Is that, first of all, is that a reasonably fair analysis or a reasonably fair summation of your position or not?
So I think of what I'm doing with Titian and Michelangelo is creating a very big picture, a kind of mosaic in which we have lots and lots of documents. These are some of the best documented artists of the Renaissance. So it's a mosaic with lots of tesserae that are surviving, but of course it's an old mosaic, and a lot of the tesserae are missing. But I think in certain cases, if you see the whole picture of what you're trying to construct, even the missing tesserae, probably you can imaginatively inform yourself of what that is most likely to be, to connect the missing tesserae that are not there. And in this, I've been in this way of sort of thinking the gaps, filling the gaps with informed imagination, is really has come from I've learned this from historians, and one in particular that you yourself interviewed that I think very highly of is John Eliot, who recently wrote his autobiography about history in the making. And he writes something that is very telling and much shorter than what you read to me. But here, John Eliot writes, I believe that theory is of less importance for the writing of good history than the ability to enter imaginatively into the life of a society, remote in time or place, and produce a plausible explanation of why its inhabitants thought and behaved as they did. And this is written by John Eliot, one of the most distinguished and most careful of documentary historians. But what he's trying to do is provide a plausible explanation. And I think that's all I'm trying to do in my idea of informed imagination, filling in those gaps that give us a plausible look at the whole picture. Because we have so much of the whole picture, we can usually cover the gaps.
Let me move on and pick up on what the basic points of building this mosaic that you're talking about. Because as I understand it, having read your book, the three principal events upon which you build this mosaic are the three either direct interactions or semi-direct interactions of these two figures, of Michelangelo and Titian. So the first one being in 1529 when Michelangelo goes to Ferrara, and he's with the Duke of Ferrara, and he sees some of Titian's paintings for the first time. The second one being in 1530 when he runs away from Florence for a few weeks, and he actually encounters Titian along with other people. And the third is in 1546 when Titian comes to Rome when Michelangelo is there. So there are three events that the historical record supports upon which to build, as you say, this mosaic. And this strikes me as a completely reasonable way to proceed. And in fact, yesterday, as it happens, I was talking to another one of your colleagues, Stephen Campbell, and we were talking about the nature of biography. And he has, as you may know from his latest book on Leonardo, he criticizes many contemporary biographers. And I specifically mentioned what I just said to you now, which is, well, look at what Bill Wallace is doing with his combination of imagination and building. Well, I didn't say building a mosaic because those are your words, but this idea of building a story and imagining what might have happened based upon our solid documentary scholarly evidence of what we actually know has happened at the time. Isn't that the sort of thing that we should be doing? And he said, yes, absolutely. He was certainly unhesitating in his sense that this is exactly the sort of thing which needs to be done and is to the benefit of all of us. So I would naively think, perhaps, that that's a mainstream view, but maybe it's not.
Well, I appreciate that. I admire Stephen Campbell immensely, so I think that's nice. Maybe things are changing. Maybe things are changing. I'm anticipating more criticism than I've actually received. I'm anticipating that maybe people will come down hard on that. So it hasn't actually happened yet.
I don't know. So I'm not an art historian. So it just seems to me, as long as one is intellectually honest, and as long as one recognizes what one can say with confidence is true or not, and say, okay, here I'm indulging in speculation. Here I may be, imagining and fabricating it. This seems plausible to me, but I can't say with any certainty whether it's true or not. I don't see how that's being irresponsible in any conceivable way, and all you're doing is engaging. I think the problem lies when you elide those distinctions and you say, well, I'm pretty sure this is the case, or when you actually don't know, then you're running into difficulties. But if you proceed with a more cautionary approach, when you're being very explicit about what you're imagining and what you have good reason to take as actually established truth, I find it hard to believe why anybody would take issue with that. But
I think
anyway.
I think your point is well taken. I think maybe the field is changing, and it's not just maybe art history is just changing a little more slowly, because I think this sort of thing is happening in literary studies all the time, especially in biography. I remember way back when Dutch was published, the biography of Ronald Reagan. The author actually put himself into the book. This is a biography of Reagan, and yet the author puts himself into the story of Reagan. And people really came down hard on that at that time. But I think things have changed dramatically, and more people are accepting of the idea of precisely what we're talking about, filling in the gaps with responsible efforts to plausible explanation, as John Eliot gives thing, and willing to change if the document arises that tells you something differently.
I'd like to get into some details of your book and ask you some questions about it, if I may, because I think these details are fascinating. And I'm going to ask you to speak to the influences here, and then I'm going to eventually move on and ask you some specific questions. But perhaps if you could speak to that would be helpful.
So what we're looking at on the right is the Death of Peter Martyr, which was long considered Titian's greatest painting. And the only reason it no longer is considered Titian's greatest painting is because it was burned in the 19th century. But it was already so famous that it had been copied multiple times, including this copy, full-size copy, which is in the original position of the painting in San Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. So this is the painting that Michelangelo certainly would have seen in Venice, because Titian was working on it and finishing it at that very moment that Michelangelo's in Venice for 6 weeks. So he has plenty of time to sort of see all the best of Titian in Venice, and there's plenty of Titian. But this was the most recent Titian. And Michelangelo's interest in the artist had already been fueled by his encounter with Titian back in Ferrara. And now, 6 weeks in Venice, he's immersed in this contemporary artist. And so what we see, I think, on the left is this very small drawing in red chalk from the Louvre, the upper one, is a memory, a recollection on Michelangelo's part of seeing this major altarpiece, drawn months later. But we know that Michelangelo had a perfect memory. He was able to memorize most of Dante, and he never forgot something that he ever saw, which was praised by multiple people in his lifetime. And he never forgot something that he ever saw, which was praised by multiple people in his lifetime, that he had this steel trap memory. So I think there's no problem with Michelangelo. He doesn't need to look at this altarpiece in order to sort of reinvent a completely different subject. Here's again, the disparity of subject has probably kept people from putting these two together in connection. We have a murder scene and a person fleeing in terror. On the left-hand side, instead, we see a resurrected Christ leaving from the tomb. This is a case where I think the actual art historical comparison of poses and composition actually does work. I think Titian has created a very unusual composition. First of all, this is an altarpiece. And you don't usually show great narratives on altarpieces, much less murder scenes as an altarpiece. An altar is a place of prayer and of transformation of the blood, of the wine into blood and the bread into the flesh of Christ. And yet over top of what's happening liturgically, you see this violent narrative unfolding. And so I think it's the narrative quality in the composition of sort of blasting open the center, breaking open the center entirely with figures going in opposite diagonal directions. That's what Michelangelo remembers, and that's what he utilizes. But it's so typical of Michelangelo that maybe the memory of Titian started him on this drawing on the left-hand side, but almost instantly after he draws the red chalk drawing, he likes the idea, and he develops it further, probably 5 minutes later in drawing the second drawing, the more fully realized drawing here from Windsor Castle in black chalk, where we really see the resurrection of Christ blasting out of the tomb, figures going in opposite diagonal directions, is still somehow developed from Titian, but has become totally Michelangelo's own idea. So much so that we tend not to make the link.
Right. And I mean, this brings up, I think, a really important point, which is, again, getting back to this idea of influence. Influence isn't copying. I mean, influence is exactly that. It's being influenced. And as you said, one can imagine, and we're forced to imagine, but it's not inconceivable by any stretch of the imagination to recognize that what's happening here is that there are some influences. We're all influenced. We all live in the world. We're influenced by all sorts of things. And yet we're creating something that is actually our own. And I think there's a very great danger in making this false equivalence when you hear, well, this person was influenced by that person, to just assume, well, they were just copying what that person actually did. And I think you make a very important point to be talking about how he owns that immediately, to the extent where, I mean, who knows what may have been going on in his mind, but it's quite conceivable he would not have even processed the idea that he was necessarily being influenced by Titian as he was doing it. He would have just somehow said, oh, this is a good idea, or something like this, and be able to put that together. Is that
very fair and precisely how Michelangelo works in everything. He sees an antique sculpture, and he's influenced by it, but he doesn't copy the influence of the antique sculpture. He just incorporates it into his own art thinking. And so he's able to transform inspiration from a variety of different locations, a variety of different sources, and turn them into something original. But that's why he's a great artist and why Michelangelo is maybe more fascinating than most people, because he's really not dependent on those sources and influences, but he makes sources and influences into something new and radically original.
Yeah. Another thing which struck me about his fuller sketch that you point out in your book is some people, a German art historian of roughly 100 years ago, came up with the idea that that sketch of a resurrection was at some point in Michelangelo's mind envisioned as being given to one of his collaborators, and we'll hopefully get to that in a moment, to be able to draw a painting that would appear in the lunette of the new sacristy, and now, I mean, all of the lunettes are blank. So a couple questions about this. First of all, how accepted is this idea? Is this just a completely fringe idea, or is that generally accepted based upon other documentation that yes, this was in fact something that he was seriously flirting with, the idea of including that resurrection scene in the lunette over the principal chapel of Il Magnifico and Giuliano de' Medici?
Well, it was a good idea 100 years ago and was embraced immediately, and a lot of people thought that's a good explanation for these drawings, because otherwise we have no reason why he's making a resurrection drawing, much less a very finished drawing that looks almost like a painting. It's finished in a way with lights and darks so that it really looks pictorial. I think then the idea faded because people have archaeologically looked into the plaster to see if the plaster was ever disturbed. Was this project ever carried out? And no, it never was carried out. And therefore, the idea of these resurrection decorations in the lunette probably faded away. And I hope maybe my book resurrects that idea, because I think it's absolutely the essential explanation for why suddenly Michelangelo is interested in making paintings and why he's making drawings for paintings just after he's been immersed in painting and looking at Titian in Venice for 6 weeks. And he comes back and he's very interested now in incorporating painting into his Medici chapel of architecture and sculpture. So it is really, in a sense, this is the first Gesamtwerk, the joining together of all the arts together. We generally assume happened in the Baroque period, but that's only because Michelangelo never quite finished his chapel. Had he finished the chapel, we would have painted decorations, I think.
I'd like to move to one of your, a really major claim, I suppose, which is that, okay, you can look at specific instances of influence, as we've looked at a little bit, but as I understand it, one of the main claims is that by seeing these Titians, by his journey to Ferrara and also his journey to Venice, he was inspired or motivated to begin collaborations with a range of other painters and actually be involved, albeit in a collaborative way, with painting, which is not something that he previously had as much motivation to be doing, and I know that before that point, the only collaboration that I know of, and please let me know if this is wrong, but the most famous collaboration that I know of is the one that he had with Sebastian and Del Piombo, and that was to a large extent, as I understood it, within the context of a kind of proxy war with Raphael and so forth. At least that's the mythology that one hears about these sorts of things, that Piombo and Raphael were at loggerheads and jealous, and Michelangelo was on the side, wanted to do something and was aligning himself with Del Piombo. Rather than have you wade into that, although feel free to step in at any moment, my question is this. Del Piombo, of course, was also from Venice and was a former colleague of Titian's, or at least knew Titian to some extent, and used the Venetian style and so forth. Do you think that to some extent, or to any extent, this collaboration that Michelangelo had with Del Piombo primed him, made him more thinking about, in particular, the use of color and paint in a way that he was more susceptible to these influences with Titian. And in fact, later on, these people that he partnered with were, as you pointed out, famous colorists. Was this something that was that at some point may have been to some extent precipitated by his previous relationship with Del Piombo?
Without a doubt, absolutely critical. The most important, connection to prepare Michelangelo for the encounter with Titian. There's no doubt about it. And you can see here, for example, this is Michelangelo indulging in compositions of multiple figures. And he does that because he's collaborating with a painter. So that's when he makes compositions. And so it's with the collaboration with Piombo that he's exposed to the idea of narrative, multiple figure compositions, and color. And the thing that is not documented, but is so important that we've talked about, is how long did Piombo and Michelangelo stay friends together, and how much did they talk about Titian? All of which was, done over tea and coffee. But none of it's documented. So Michelangelo has a very well prepared landscape of Venetian painting and who Titian is and what Titian's up to, thanks to Sebastian del Piombo. I think absolutely primed him for his encounter with Titian to make it positive.
So here are 3 collaborators that he chose, people that he was actively involved with, that had a reputation for being noted colorists. In his mind, do you think this was a way of somehow competing with the Venetian type of colorist outlook? Because as I understand it, you have a different sort of style. You're both using color, but this is much more from a sort of a standard Tuscan, drawing centered orientation, which of course is because the drawings came from Michelangelo, as opposed to Titian's more painterly approach. So do you think, speculating, that maybe what Michelangelo is doing is he's embarking and not just being sort of subconsciously influenced, but he's engaging at some level in outright competition with Titian?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. So yes, these are 3 colorists, and the attraction is that they're really good colorists, and Michelangelo can make the design, they can do the color. But Michelangelo is never going to want to do Titian or to do Venetian art, as we talked about with the Resurrection drawing, how quickly he makes it his own. What he's doing is, I think, precisely what you suggest, competition. Okay, you're the best colorist and you're the Venetian artist, but look at what we can do when you join color to good design, which is what Michelangelo emphasizes, the good drawing, good design. And so, yes, he's saying this is not Venetian painting, but we can do things that are as beautiful as Venetian painting, but this is how we do it in Florence. And all of these relationships are not fly-by-night quick things. They are deep investments in these 3 individuals. He lives with Daniele da Volterra for the last 15 years of his life. He's very close to Marcello Venusti for 20 years or more. And he would be much longer in a relationship with Jacopo Pontormo if Jacopo Pontormo wasn't such a schizophrenic idiot. But he was a fabulous artist, but a very strange personality. So yes, competition is absolutely at the core here. Doing it, this is the way we do it. He's not trying to imitate Titian. He's learning from Titian, but doing it his own way, Michelangelo's way.
Right. And I mean, we talked a little bit about Del Piombo, and you mentioned earlier about how their relationship went off the rails, but not until a little while longer. I mean, might one argue, as I understand it, might one argue that the reason he picked these particular artists to collaborate with at this time rather than Del Piombo was because he wanted something a little bit more Tuscan oriented, a little bit more Disegno oriented. Is that a fair
Disegno oriented and
assessment?
reliable. These are two, Daniele and Marcello Venusti were extremely reliable individuals who served Michelangelo more than one way. We're only talking about how they served him as an artist, but they're also really very close friends and housemates. So they're living on a day-to-day basis. They're really close to one another. Michelangelo was godfather to Marcello Venusti's children, one of whom was named Michelangelo. So these are, the relationship is well beyond just the art and the competition, but it's well part of Michelangelo's life and circles, the expanding circles. And one other point I wanted to make about what he's doing here, I think he's learned from Titian and from Raphael that reproducing yourself, multiplying yourself is a positive thing. Originally, Michelangelo was very much against the idea of engraving. He didn't like the idea of engraving because they were reproductive. They were reproducing in multiples. But he realized how successful, right, for example, Raphael was in collaborating with Marcantonio Raimondi to expand his influence, to expand his art, and to send it internationally. His art could be sent internationally through prints and copies. And Michelangelo begins to realize that a reputation can be built through the medium of other people. Just as Raphael had a huge workshop with many people collaborating with him and multiplying Raphael, so that Raphael has a tremendous influence well beyond precisely what just Raphael made. So Michelangelo begins to realize that he too can have a reputation far more vast if he works through other people in collaboration than if he just does everything by himself, which he tended to do early in his life.
Yeah, and this seems to me analogous to a point that you made earlier in terms of project management, right? In terms of these that as he evolves, as he gets older, he learns to delegate more. He learns to partner with other people in a different sort of way. He's not micromanaging as much. So it seems to me that this is of a piece in a way in terms of his potential outlook on things.
Very fair, very nice. And it's largely due to the fact that he lived 89 years. He had two lifetimes to change.
Right, or at least evolve. So as you say, lots of different works. Obviously, we don't have time. Definitely, one has to buy the book, and these are very, very explicitly detailed. I'd like to switch a little bit, just very briefly, because we're running out of time. You've been very, very gracious with your time. Thank you very much.
What?
I'd like to go the other way a little bit and highlight some of the purported influences that Michelangelo had on Titian. And so here's one again. Perhaps you could just speak to it quite quickly, and then I have some follow-up questions to ask.
Well, this is the case. On the right-hand side is one of the very late paintings of Titian, painted, I believe, even after Michelangelo's death. But Titian had been painting Annunciations all his life. He felt like he was like the expert in Annunciations, and in fact, many other people thought the same. And he was commissioned repeatedly to paint Annunciations. And while Titian was in Rome, he was in Rome for 6 months at a time when Michelangelo was painting 2 Annunciations in collaboration with Marcello Venusti. And Titian saw both of these pictures. And just as we said, he recognized it as competition, that Michelangelo was trying to do Annunciation and trying to do it different. It's very colorful, it's very dramatic, it's very narrative, but it's very, very definitely heavily influenced by Michelangelo's own sense of design rather than color. And so I think on the right-hand side, we see Titian making the final statement, just saying, no. Michelangelo's Annunciations, and I think we feel them to this day, are kind of dry, barren, a little bit acidic in their color, whereas Titian is utterly, completely indulgent and celebratory about the explosive nature of this subject and what's going on. He makes it into a dramatic opera, compared, I think I said in the book, to Michelangelo's very kind of boring oratorio type painting.
Yeah. So here we have a purported reference / influence, And I'm finally at the point where I'm not sure if I disagree with you, but I might be diverging a tiny bit from you. So here's the argument as I understand it. So Michelangelo dies. Vasari writes his second edition of his lives, whereupon at least I think he mentions Titian, but he's still fairly dismissive of him and certainly doesn't give him the attention and credit that he deserves. Roughly at this time, Titian produces this painting of Judith and Holofernes, and the idea is that maybe the head of Holofernes actually represents Michelangelo / Vasari. So I don't know anything about this, but I have an opinion because, these days you have an opinion about everything. So I have an opinion. So it seems to me, based upon what you've said and what you've described and other things that I know, that it's a bit far-fetched that Titian would portray Michelangelo in this particular way. Because I mean, I don't know at all, and most of what I know is actually through you, so maybe it's not particularly fair. But I don't get the sense from what you've described that he had such a particular vendetta against Michelangelo that he would present him in this way. I mean, maybe I'm being overly dramatic because I know in a lot of cases with David and Goliath, people portray them so they have a self-portrait of themselves as Goliath's head and all the rest of that. So maybe I'm taking this too literally. I do, on the other hand, see that it would make sense under the circumstances, and I'm doubtless I'm imposing my own 21st century moral framework on a Renaissance masterpiece. But I do see why he would want to slice off the head of Vasari, quite frankly. That actually makes sense to me. And looking at that head and looking at those two lithographs of the various people, I can't actually tell the difference of who would who be. So I'm much more sensitive to the idea that it's Vasari's head that he's slicing off and not Michelangelo's. But what's your view?
I'm perfectly happy with that. I think that's precisely. I think actually the decapitation of Vasari was probably the primary motivation here. Titian is reading Vasari's life, and he's really treated very shabbily in comparison to Michelangelo. The truth is, though, Titian is a much nastier human being than Michelangelo was. He was not particularly nice. It was horrible to his children, and his children were horrible to him. So he had a really sort of disastrous, personal life in certain ways. So that's maybe part of the motivation to decapitate Michelangelo. But I'm perfectly willing to agree with you that really Vasari is the one that he wants to decapitate, because it's Vasari who's really forms Titian's reputation in comparison to Michelangelo. At 1/5 the length, he criticizes Titian repeatedly in his life for not finishing his pictures, not drawing, not learning how to draw. So I can see that Vasari would be the motivating factor here. I do suggest in the book, however, that another possibility, which may solve your problem a little bit. Titian trained his daughter, Lavinia, to become a very good painter, and we now are beginning to discover more and more paintings by Lavinia. And Lavinia is here certainly the model for Judith, but could she also maybe be the painter here? And she's doing her father's work for him. Painting, this is what Vasari and Michelangelo did to my father. But that's just another suggestion. But I love your suggestion. I think yours is a good one. If you look at these two, they're woodcuts. They're almost interchangeable. Vasari and Michelangelo both have beards and noses. So it could be. In any case, we don't know anything about this painting. So my effort here is to make a first stab at, let's look at this painting by Titian and wonder why it came about. Why did Titian paint this picture?
I was intrigued by the proposition of this maybe being Lavinia who painted it. And I was going to ask you this, but I'm running out of time. I'm taxing your patience heavily, and I didn't want to go too far into it. But that did actually intrigue me, because I tried to look up a general sense of her reputation independently, and I didn't run into very much. So my sense is that that seems to be, if not a lone voice, uh, at least just one of a few number of people who might suggest such a thing. Is that changing? Are more and more people actually looking at Titian's daughter as a not just with this painting, obviously potentially including this painting, but more generally, are they starting to pay more attention to her abilities in general? Because that seems to be happening with quite a few other female artists. So I'm just wondering if it's also happening with Lavinia.
Precisely, yes. And it's because of the interest now, the really universal interest in women artists and how they've been marginalized. The recuperation of women's reputations as artists is an ongoing effort. And so there really is much more interest in Titian's Lavinia than had been in the past, and it's fairly recent. The problem there is that we just don't have very many documents. So we know the relationship and we know that Titian trained her, but what we have to depend on is good eyes identifying a picture that we think would be painted by her rather than by her father. And that's back to the connoisseurship and attribution of old art history, because we just don't have the documents.
So just before we leave this, and we are careening towards the end, I want to circle back to the very, very beginning of the book. Now that we've quickly gone through some of the main points and ideas and so forth, and at the very beginning, you highlight this anecdote, which I think has been quite famous, that was immortalized by Vasari, where Michelangelo is in Rome and sees the Danae by Titian and says all sorts of polite things in the company of Titian. And then when he leaves, he says to him in confidence, well, it's too bad Venetians never learned how to draw. And so having gone through this book, having studied the influences, having speculated and imagined and combined that with your scholarly knowledge, what do you think he really meant by that? I mean, because he clearly was somebody who was an independent thinker. He clearly was somebody who respected Titian's abilities. And he clearly, I would imagine, is somebody who did not believe that everybody should do everything in the same style as everybody else. So I would argue, at least it seems to me, again, I don't know anything to speculate, but it doesn't stop me from speculating. It seems to me that it would be reasonable to assume that he would say, well, Titian, in his own way, is obviously extremely accomplished, and there's, he could respect him for what he did and the way that he did it, rather than say, well, this is necessarily secondary because it's not according to the principles of what I think should be done with painting. But maybe that's just me speculating. So maybe he was, so my interpretation of this is, I'm thinking maybe he was using it ironically, or he was just teasing, or he was just being particularly acerbic, or he was, he was just being difficult, as opposed to legitimately saying Titian's works would be better if he did it in the style in which I was raised and which I think, all painting should be done.
I think that's a very nice suggestion. Yeah, and it may be multiple aspects of of your suggestion there that I think, first of all, that the praise of Titian was genuine, and it was to Titian's face. And that was an admiration of a very large and very impressive and very beautifully painted painting. The private comment, I think, would be natural because Michelangelo spent his life studying the human body anatomy, mostly male, but even he could tell that the drawing of Danae is not very well drawn. It's just anatomically not very correct. So I can see that Michelangelo easily could fall into a criticism, but also making a larger statement that really, you would be better if you learned how to draw first and then painted, because that's how we do it in Florence. And remember, most importantly, Howard, who's telling us this story is Vasari, and he's telling it not in Michelangelo's lifetime, but after Michelangelo's death, and for Vasari's own purpose of promoting Tuscan art and disegno in opposition to Venice and Colorito. So there might be as much Vasari behind this comment as there is Michelangelo. I'm trusting that Vasari has captured something of the truth of what Michelangelo said rather than the specifics.
So that's a very good summation. Speaking of summation, it's time to wind things up. I've just got a few general questions to ask you. Again, thank you very much
My pleasure.
for your time. I'd like to ask you a general question about Michelangelo studies. So you talked about how you were inspired by a mentor who assured you that every generation can come up with interesting perspectives, new answers, new treatments, new questions to age-old problems or problems about art. How healthy or unhealthy would you say the state of Michelangelo research is today?
Incredibly healthy and always will be. And it's proof of Howard Hibbard that every generation really does have something new to say about Michelangelo. And the obvious one here is the very huge interest now in gender and sexuality and ethnicity. None of that has ever been applied or thought about in terms of Michelangelo. Really, there's a whole study of gender and sexuality. Much has been done on his own particular homosexuality, but the larger questions that are being asked in art history about the place of women, gender, all kinds of topics like this are ripe for investigation. And moreover, we keep discovering Michelangelos. I don't think most of the ones we discover are actually by Michelangelo, but it keeps the pot boiling and it keeps everybody thinking about Michelangelo constantly. And all these discoveries, in a way, sort of bring us back to what he actually accomplished, and that's almost good enough. But the discoveries, in a sense, reignite the interest of a new generation in looking at an old artist that it comes alive through discovery. And so I think there's still very healthy things to do with Michelangelo.
Thanks very much for watching this video podcast. For more engaging art-related content, check out our Exploring Art History Substack, our short films on our Exploring Art History YouTube channel, and Ideas Roadshow's full-length documentaries. Visit our website, ideasroadshow.com, for more details.